because of the clear fill system that we generally use, you create a clear fill that, well, pretty much like this. Pine weevil will then breed in the stumps. So what happens is in a couple of years after you harvest, you'll get a spike in the population because you've created a fantastic breeding ground for them. So what happens is you come along and plant your nice little seedlings and the pine weevil annihilate them. So what we used to do was just a ballpark kind of standard 2-year gap between harvesting and restock. Apparently what happens is you get, because pine weevil, it's like a lot of other populations of insects, you get cyclical, you get these dips and peaks and troughs of their breeding. So you may be alright 2 years down the line to plant, but then year 3 you get a spike, or year 4 you might get a spike. So now they then what they've done is they increased the fallow period to 4 years. But that then starts to have issues with your sustainability because you're not replanting quickly enough after your clear felling, so there's a lag, quite a long lag. So what they do now is they do monitoring of individual sites, called billet monitoring, and what you do is you put out small sections of wood that will attract pine weevils, just a small section, and you dot them across your site. And basically you go every few days and you see how many, you basically count the number of weevil that are on your little stump and multiply that across to give you a ballpark figure of what the population's doing. So what they're suggesting now is if you're getting low numbers, you get an implant. If you're getting high numbers, you delay. So it means you're bringing forward some of your sites. So instead of this not doing anything for 4 years and then doing a whole load of sites every 4 years, you'll be planting some of your sites. There's also what they've done in some changes is they'll plant right away. We're joking about hot planting. That's what hot planting is. The minute you finish harvesting, you plant that first season right after. And in theory, you should get the jump because you're at least a year ahead of the pine weevil. We have had there's 2 ways we sell timber, roadside and standing. Roadside is where either our own guys or our own directly employed contractors who do the felling, bring the timber to roadside, and then it's a roadside sale. That timber is then sold to a merchant. What merchants can do is come in and buy an area of trees that's standing. That's what we call standing sales. So we'll measure an area, tell them how much volume is in it, what the product breakout is, and they'll bid an open market. So they'll buy a section of standing trees and then bring in their own people to fell it. And usually that's all happens. They'll fell it and then move on, and then the site's ours again to replant. They started to introduce contracts just a few years ago where the standing sales merchant not only buys standing timber and fells the timber himself, he then has to restock the site on our behalf, and he will charge us whatever the figure is. So he doesn't want to delay because he wants paid. So the way the contracts are written, the first planting season after an area has been felled, they will replant that. So in theory, again, that will get the jump on the pine weevil. You're ahead of the game slightly, hopefully. So that's the kind of changes we've had over the last few years. Don't think anything else has changed recently. I haven't heard of anything. That's your different options. The other possibility, of course, is that you use treated trees with insecticide. That's kind of fallen out of favour now, just because we're on just from an environmental point of view, we've got a chemical reduction policy. We try to use chemicals as little as possible. So suddenly treating several million trees every year with insecticide and sending them out and planting them just really isn't acceptable anymore. We put a lot of money into it a few years ago, but I think it's become kind of unacceptable. Does the private sector still do it?
Yeah, they do. Most of them have been different types have been banned. Gazelle's still there, being used, and that's probably going to be banned. It's looking like it will be banned on the horizon once more evidence is gathered. But yeah, so everyone's looking for the new biological.
I always thought the drawback with, well, it was permethrin.
Permethrin, yeah.
Permethrin we used. The drawback is the pine weevil actually has to take a bite out of your seedling and ingest some of the insecticide. So if you get enough of them taking a bite out of the seedling, they might all die, but they might have all just killed your seedling at the same time. So it wasn't quite perfect. I did see a system trialled in North Scotland a number of years ago, probably 20 years ago, where they sprayed a nematode solution.
Mm.
So basically, it's well used in horticulture to combat various. I think vinewave was one of the ones where you basically make up a mixture of nematode worms in a solution, and you spray it, and the nematodes just take care of your insect pest. So they tried something similar for pine weevil, and in theory it's fantastic. You just spray your site with this nematode solution, and they just wipe out the pine weevil, and it does work. It works pretty well. The practicalities of actually getting a massive solution of nematodes across a site that might be, well, this is nearly 20 hectares, almost 10, 15 hectares. Because the machine I saw is they get a forwarder, and they modified it to carry a massive water tank on the back. And the forwarder is already like 15 tons. Once you get a tank full of nematode solution on the back, that's 20 plus tons. And then you have to attach some kind of very robust spraying system on the back that can take all the banging and crashing as it goes across the site. And quite frankly, it just didn't work. Mm. The nematode solution works if you can get it applied. It was getting it applied. Practicalities were just rubbish. The machine was too big, it was too heavy, it was too cumbersome. It could barely move across a rough site. And they just pulled the plug, they ditched it.
I think they also found nematodes only lasted 6 to 8 weeks as well, and they'd have to respray.
So if you miss your population peak, if you miss the adults arriving, you miss all the waste of time. Great idea. That sounded great at the time.
Yeah.
Like I say, it's heavily used in horticulture, but it's your scale's just so much smaller. You know, you got a backpack. It's much simpler, you know. Or if you're doing an agriculture where you've got a nice flat field and a boom sprayer on the tractor, that works really easy. On our sites, I mean, this is actually a well-developed flat site. On some of our rough patterns, so it's just the practicalities. And again, it's. And of course, you're playing around with biological agents again, so you're worried about your balance. So it's tricky to say the least. But yeah, it looked great on paper, but the machine was ridiculous. It was huge. So there we go. But yeah, it didn't. I suppose I had to try something.
Yeah, to keep up. They're still doing
It doesn't work unless you try. So that's the various things. So at the moment they have this billeting system, monitoring system. So I think they'll carry on with that for a bit. Although the trouble with that is it's just labour intensive.
Is it considered high here, or medium, or low? Do you know?
Moray used to be relatively high, simply because it's a drier climate. It's a nicer climate, less harsh with the insects. So the season would be longer, probably.
Yeah.
But in general terms, I haven't heard of any huge problems. The fallow period worked really well. You left it 4 years, and the majority of your sites were probably going to be all right. But it's just too much of a delay. If you're trying to do sustainable forestry, you get this lag. And then if for any reason there's an issue where you don't get sites planted, then there's a further delay. So it's.
How much of an issue is the weevil with the continuous cover stuff? I mean, I know you've got the problem that some of it's close to clear fell, but
it's less of an issue because we don't really do much clear fill. In the areas where we do continuous cover, because of the good stability, we don't do too much clear fill. So that's where they breed in the stumps and the wood.
But would you find them there in the
They'll be there, but they'll just be at a lower population level where it's not an issue. It's like any other pest. If they're below a certain population level, it's not really an issue, because there's lots of insects out there that in theory can do us a lot of damage. But if they're kind of nice, if you've got everything in balance, the population level's all right. You know, it's not. You'll get some damage, but not enough to really worry about. The worry comes where you upset the balance and you get a spike in the population, and that's where climate change is an issue. If you suddenly get climatic conditions that favour a particular pest, that population is going to go up, and it's going to probably go up quite quickly. This is the problem. I mean, I've seen photographs from the United States, West Coast. Some of the, I can't even remember the beetle's name. The whole stand's just utterly devastated because it's getting warmer and drier. It's suiting a particular species. Population's gone up and they're losing whole stands. So this is the issue. Again, it's the issue with climate change, and it's very difficult to predict. And again, this is part of this idea of diversifying your species as much as possible. So if it favours a particular species, make sure that you don't have 80% of your forest of that particular
Sick of-
species. Otherwise, you might as well just retire now.
Yeah.
It's just wasting your time. So you've got to, because normally in a natural ecosystem, undisturbed ecosystem, if there's any left that hasn't been touched with man, you tend to get a balance. So any pest as it starts to come up in number, something else is probably going to eat it.
Yeah.
But once it goes past a certain point, again the natural control doesn't work because it's just been overwhelmed. So ideally, the more diverse you have, the better.
Yeah.
And try and keep that kind of natural system. And in the last 20 years, we're increasingly managing deadwood and creating deadwood because we know we get predatory beetles breed in the deadwood, and if you can get enough of them, they'll take care of a lot of the pests for you.
Yeah.
But in the past, when I first started, late 80s, early 90s, every bit of wind blow, it was considered untidy. To a human eye, it looks untidy.
Yeah.
So you go and clear it up. Dead trees don't look good. Again, if there's dead trees through your stand, you go and cut them down and take them out. Part of the old ideas in Germany, donkeys years and years ago, talked about forest hygiene. And a part of that, and again in research, was you took out the dead stuff because you thought it would harbour pests. It also harbours predatory beetles and all sorts of other insects that give you this balance. So the minute you start interfering and upsetting that balance, you're really letting your guard down. Because it just takes one insect to suddenly get favourable conditions to start going up. The predators, you've taken away the breeding sites of a lot of predatory beetles and things like that. And it's gone. They pushed a lot to start with in the late 90s, early noughties for us leaving standing deadwood, because there was a lot of Swedish research that was showing that standing deadwood was fantastic for a whole wide range of species that were a real benefit to your forest. The only trouble is, by then it was almost too late in the UK, because most of the species had died out because we'd been so good at taking away all the deadwood. So there's very few of those species left. So now we're actually saying there's more importance of deadwood on the ground. Because the beauty of that is you've got part of the wood is exposed to the sunlight and it's dry. The bit on the ground is damp. So you've almost created two habitats. So there's different insects will use the damp wood as opposed to the drier wood that's dried out in the sun. So what we're getting the guys to do now is just to leave piles of timber.
Yeah.
Preferably in the shade. It's not too critical, but you can scatter it across the site. If you find a patch of wind blow in a clear felt, I'm saying to the guys, just leave it.
Yeah.
And ideally leave a few trees round about it as future deadwood.
Yeah.
They'll eventually blow down.
Yeah.
So that when the original deadwood is rotted away, those species can jump into the next bit that's blown down. It's fresh. So you're trying to create as much as a balance as possible and trying to mimic natural occurrences. Wind blow is natural. Trees blow down and they rot. That's what happens in a natural forest. But if we're too, what's the right word? If we're too tidy, we've got to get away from this human mindset of thinking that something looks untidy. Nature's untidy. That's what happens. Things fall down and rot and clamber around, and it doesn't look all ordered, but it is.
Yeah.
There is a natural balance happening there. So the more of that you can do, the better. We had, if you watch any of the Autumn Watch or Spring Watch programmes on television, a few years ago, Kate Humble used to present them. And she did a special one-off one day before the Spring Watch series came on, and she's walking in this wood near where she lives down in Wales. And she just says, oh yeah, there's a lack of nesting holes and dead trees for birds in the UK because in modern forestry operations they cut all the deadwood down. And I was screaming at the television. I said, that's wrong.
That's just not
That's
true.
plain wrong. Somebody on that programme did not do the research. I was shot the researcher on that programme because it was plain wrong, because the last 20 odd years we've done nothing else.
Slightly behind the times on that one.
Just, I mean, if she'd said that in the 1970s, even the early 80s, yeah, fine. I would have gone along with that.
Yeah.
But you walk through any of our woods now and you'll find we leave it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're changing, don't it? It's slow, but it's we are changing. But yeah, we're screaming at it.
I bet.
So yeah, I think if you diversify your tree species as much as possible, and hopefully your biodiversity will increase. And it's all deadwood, all sorts of things. We talk a lot about in conservation big projects and creating big areas. Actually, most forests are a collection of small scale. A mixture of little habitats dotted around. You'll get clearing that's a different soil type, so you won't, maybe the trees won't grow there, it's too wet. You'll get a different species there, or grasses or something, or a bit of wetland. There's little patches. So that on a small scale I think is almost as important as the really big scale stuff. The trouble with fir forests, they're not really that big. It's difficult to do something big scale. So just try and diversify as much as possible.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, it's less than 10 years ago I can remember foresters that I worked with, kind of old school, saying, oh, people are complaining about wind blow because it looks untidy, we should go and tidy it up. Well, no, we'll get better things to do than send a harvester for several days just to tidy up wind blow. You're not going to recover much timber out of it because it's broken. So what's the point? But they had this mindset that it should be tidy.
Chipping
In theory, from a biodiversity point of view, it's the last thing you want is tidy. You want to create as many little niches and nooks and crannies for insects and beasts as much as possible, because that's what will give you diversity.
Yeah.
So, there you go. Well, how about we look at this like